Okay, so in our last video, we showed using platform.uno to basically create an application, an app for the Surface Duo. We showed the unique problems that are associated with the Surface Duo in that there are basically two screens and you've got to figure out how to partition your content between the two screens. In this video, we're basically going to show the same thing, but this time we're going to be using Xamarin Forms. So Xamarin Forms is the standard way of doing this. Xamarin is owned by Microsoft, and this is the technology that they've developed for for building cross-platform applications. It's a write once, run anywhere solution, similar to platform.uno. So what is the difference between Xamarin Forms and platform.uno? The fundamental difference is in the nomenclature or the terms that are used for describing controls. For just a brief history, so Microsoft basically created this technology called UWP, or actually Xamarin many years ago, and many years ago. I mean, almost 15 years ago, they created XAML. And XAML basically was a way to describe user interfaces. It's a language, an XML-based language for describing user interfaces. This language has gone through numerous iterations, but the key controls, the key naming conventions, the key manipulation methodology have essentially remained the same. That's why it's very easy for me, even though I don't know platform.uno very well, meaning that I don't know all the things that they've done, because they're using XAML and the XAML standard, the standard way of writing XAML. And I understand that from understanding WPF and Silverlight, and I think there was one called Metro, and now UWP. Just 1,000 different technologies. They've all utilized this user interface nomenclature with minor differences here and there, but they utilize this for describing controls, right? So on the flip side, there was another company called Xamarin that used to be part of Novell, that split out and started sort of like building their own version of .NET for non-Microsoft environments. So they took .NET and they built it for Linux, for Mac, for other things. That was the whole idea, so that you could really create a write once, run anywhere solution using .NET, right? And at some point, once we started, once Silverlight, I think, came out, they then created something called Moonlight that basically was Silverlight were using their Mono platform, right? The platform that they use for all this stuff is called Mono at the time, right? And they then developed their own nomenclature for user interface design, right? And that's what you're looking at here. So whereas Microsoft uses text block and text box and things like that, they use label, right? Whereas frame in the Microsoft world, the UWP world, means almost like a browser window. Frame here just means a box, right? Now, there's a cost benefit, right? Because again, Microsoft has done a lot of work in user interfaces and has a good solid understanding of how to put these things together. So the UWP platform is very robust. It has a lot of things that you can do with it. Whereas the Xamarin Forms has been more designed around being able to have the lowest common denominator between the various platforms that they are trying to target. So because of that, there's capabilities that you'll find in UWP, in the platform.uno, that you will not find inside of Xamarin Forms, right? So the purpose of doing this is basically just of this whole discussion is just to explain why there's a difference between these two. Which one you use is up to you. Again, Microsoft owns Xamarin at this point, and so this is the quote unquote official way of doing this. Um, I have a strong suspicion. You know, I don't have anything to back it up, but I have a strong suspicion that Microsoft is going to ultimately own this platform .uno, and this is going to be sort of like somehow absorbed into everything that's being done, because this is pretty special, and this allows them to leverage everything that they've already done in the past. And it's more universal because it really allows full end-to-end development using this user interface across iOS, Android, and even the web, right? But that's neither here nor there. I don't know. I don't particularly like learning new conventions for the same things 15 years later for no reason other than, you know, we just called it something different. As a matter of fact, I've gone many times and created controls for these that use the normal names and normal properties, just so it's basically easy to, you know, for me to put together my intent without having to sort of like do a translation between what's going on here and what it normally is. But let's go ahead and let's run this application so we can show you how it looks on the device now that we're done with all the discussions. I'm just going to connect to the phone. There we go. So it basically, once you run it, as you can see, start developing now. It has a little bit of text, and then a link of what you can click to start. Basically, a boilerplate application for doing this. You see the use of frame, what it's used for. So in UWP, we have something called Border. The Universal Windows Platform, we have something called Border that basically does the same thing. But allows you to have rounded corners and things of that nature. So it's just different naming conventions, which is what makes it somewhat, you know, somewhat frustrating for people who have been in this technology for a while now. So let's go ahead and let's attach it to the middle. And so as you can see, this is showing up now as a fully expanded application. And as you might imagine, and that spells trouble for us on device, right? Because that means that there's that border somewhere down here that's basically blocking some content. And if I open it on, you know, and if I show a video of this right now, as you can see, there's this border right here that's blocking the X and pretty much all of the A, half of the X and all of the A, right? So we have to essentially do the same thing, meaning that we have to, once again, split the screen and split the content between the screen to have it all work properly. So let's go ahead and let's do that. So fortunately, there are some things that remained the same between the two versions of describing user interfaces. One of them is grid. So we do have a grid also in Xamarin Forms. Okay, and the grid also follows the same exact nomenclature. So to illustrate that, I'm actually going to take the columns from here and I'm going to paste them in here. And as you can see, it works absolutely fine. So we've now created a grid that split the content into two sections. So because this is much richer, since it's boilerplate, I'm gonna sort of like set this up so that the screen looks a little bit better than it did last time. So the first thing I'm gonna do is I'm gonna create another stack layout. So over here, stack layout, over here, stack panel, right? Same thing. And then I am actually gonna move this guy, the border and everything, into the stack layout. Okay. And actually, to make it a little bit cooler, how about we move the border outside the stack layout? So we'll put that here, and we'll give it a height of 50. And then over here, we would just have the text. So what it should do is it should have, again, we'll see how this turns out. But what it should do is it should have this sort of like long blue border across across both sides, because again, this is not going to be in any specific column, right? And then and then we would then have the text over here on one side, right? And then we would have the rest of the text on the other side, okay? So I'm also gonna take this and put that here. And then the rest of it I'm gonna put here. And then we can do the same thing, that equals 0. And over here, this is the first column, 1. And oh, sorry. So yeah, I've got to figure out what yeah, I think this should work fine. So the Xamarin is going to show up there. That's going to show up here. Yeah, let's see how this looks. And over here, you can see that this is a little bit on the gnarly side, but let's take it and put it down the middle. Okay, there's one mistake that we made here, which is that okay. So the mistake we made here is that we did not span this across 2 columns. So you see now it's spanned across 2 columns. And then the other mistake that we made is that we did provide a height. Okay, but we did not create a did not create something that basically specified where it starts. So over here, we have this notion of orientation. And over here, we have this notion of options, which basically define where it's pinned to. So in this case, we're pinning it to start vertically. So it's going to show up at the top. If you pin it to end, it'll show up at the bottom. It should show up at the bottom, right? So if you look, go here. So if you pin it to end, it should show up at the bottom. If you pin it to start, it should show up at the top. And then we also need to shift this text right here down, start development now, and all the text on the right side down so that there's only the top part showing, okay? So let's go ahead and do that. So we'll put this back to start. Okay. The good thing about this, and I can sort of show it here, is that um, uh, the good thing about Xamarin Forms is that it has something called edit and continue. And I could benefit from this right now. I could benefit from a dual screen right now where I could see both. But typically, if you make any change in the Xamarin while it's running, it will actually modify it here. So for example, if I put in here end and save it, see it moves down to end. Hopefully you saw that. Let's put it back to start. Okay. Then it's gonna move back up to start. There we go. So we've got this here, and I think this is fine. We could actually make it smaller. So we can make it 25. There we go. And then let's go over here and first of all, let's put a little margin on both of them. Well, let's put a margin here on both of them. So that gives a little bit of leeway for the text. And then we need to shift this guy down. Okay, so that's fine, but this guy should be maybe 100. No, 100 is too much. Let's make it 50. Okay, so we know that it's 50 plus 15. So altogether it's 65. Pardon my cat. So altogether it's 65. So over here on the right side, we can actually just go ahead and make this 65. And that should move it down to align properly. Oh no, that's not gonna work. So let's make it 25, 65. Okay, 1565. So, okay, 1565. Perfecto. And then basically just have to move this guy down. Start developing now. 50. Okay. There we go. Okay, so then we look at this, and here is how it basically looks. So what should happen is, again, you can imagine this imaginary line right here. Welcome to Xamarin Forms should show up properly. And then over here, all of this should basically show like it normally would on another screen. Of course, if you take this and move it to one screen, all bets are off. It starts looking weird again, as you can see. Note that the wrapping is automatic over here. So of course, we're going to have to, as with everything, do some code slinging in order to get it to work, basically show a different view when it's in a small form as when it's in a large form. But in general, that's very typical, right? So if I open this now in the regular view, let me show you the screen, right? This is how this should look. So this is how it looks like that. And then if you make it full, And that's how it displays at full. And it's properly showing both sides. And again, I can click things here that'll work over there. And, everything should work normal. And again, this is doing it in a brute force manual way. There will obviously be less, there's as mentioned, there are controls that Microsoft has provided for doing this that basically are that basically simplify this process for you and also allow you to have some type of detection where it knows when you're switching back and forth, I would imagine. um in normal form, the fastest way to sort of like get this done now that we have this here is we can actually go in here and you can subscribe to the size changed event. Right. So when the size change event is called, it'll basically, we'll be able to look at the height and the width. Okay. Okay, there we go, display alert. Actually, I don't want to do that. I just want, okay. So this is just a simple thing for us to be able to see the changes in size. So let's run this. Okay, so as you can see, the size starts at 540 and 680. 540 is the width, right? So that's the standard width for when you're building for Surface Duo. You can't, my advice is to build for different sizes, not necessarily different, this multiple screen sort of view. I mean, I don't know what kind of APIs exist inside of the Surface Duo for doing multi-screen. But since there are no capabilities inside of Android 10 that I know of for multi-screen, it doesn't support it. The only thing anyone can really do is just sort of say, hey, look, when my application is on a screen that looks like this, here's how I want it to display. When it's on a screen that looks like this, here's how I want it to display, right? And sort of use that a split screen, evenly split screen visual, setup to handle that, right? And then if you take your app, which is a normal phone app, let's just say, and you happen to put it on a tablet, a real tablet, it'll just split the screen based on what it is you're trying to do for that application, right? Because some applications, there's nothing wrong with splitting the screen. If you take a mail application, the screen should be split, right? And the screen should be split when you should be able to sort of like go through all your mails on one side and then sort of like have a preview of the mail itself on the other side. That's a standard use case, and it doesn't matter. And if the screen gets small enough where it makes sense to have it just show just a list of mails with maybe a little preview underneath each mail item, then you just show it like that. So that's the approach that you should take when doing this. Don't take the approach of basically expecting it to be multiple screens. Because again, when you build this application, you've got to build it for all the form factors, especially if you're using Xamarin Forms, in which case you have to also build it for Apple, right? You got to build it for everything. So just think about it in terms of like screen size and not in terms of various screens, sort of like how this visualizes it. It visualizes it as one giant screen, and that's really how you should be thinking about it. So let's maximize that. And as you can see, once we maximize it, the size changes, and now it's a different size. And then, you know, it shows up like that. So basically, I could have code in here that says, hey, look, when the size is higher than, I could take the whole screen, the width of the full application, the full, not the full application, the width of the full phone on both sides. And I could say when the screen size is half of that, right? Or when the screen size is this number, when the screen size is, you know, is 500, always show it like this. When the screen size is 600, you know, 700, always show it like this. Once the screen size hits about 800, switch it over and start showing it in split screen view, right? And then just work it like that. So what I'm going to do now on the phone is I'm going to enable the auto rotation, because I think that the auto rotated size is also different. So let's see what that size is. So that's changed. So the width when auto rotated now is 704, right? Right. So that's yet another width. So then you have to ask yourself the question, in this scenario, do I want it to be split? Right. So when it's auto rotated at 704, do I want it to be split or do I want it to be the same? Right. So based on the examples I gave there, 800 is about the point where you want it to start splitting, right? Where you're looking at a screen of 500 or 400 on each side, which might be enough real estate for, you know, for one side, right? Any more than that or any less than that, 300, and it might not make any sense. That being said, the screen size that we have, the 500 screen size, right? Actually, let me see how this looks when I flip it. Let's open this guy up. Oh, there we go. It flips, right? So this is how this looks right now when you flip it. And that width right there is 700, 704 right now, right? So does this make enough sense for your specific application? Or is there a different form factor that should show up when it's like this? These are the questions to ask, right? So if I look at what Microsoft is doing with their application at the 700 screen size, as you can see, they're still continuing to show it as one line item, right? Once I switch it over to, let's go back here. So right now at 700, it's still showing up, or at 704, whatever it is, it's still showing up like this. If I revert it to the 1,000, then it flips like that, right? So they themselves might be using some kind of, using the algorithm that I talked about, where basically if if it's on one screen, right? Like on one screen, it looks like this. And this is essentially the same thing that shows up as when it's on two screens. That's weird. That's not, okay, took a while. Let's just wait for it to connect. Yep, there we go. So here's my one screen view, right? And as you can see, my one screen view is essentially the same as my dual screen view of the application, right? Right? It's just a little bit wider. So for it to hit the size that I want, I actually have to, this is what I was talking about, the sensitivity. It's just so sensitive, it's insane, right? For it to hit the size that I want, I have to actually go over 800 or whatever that number is. I think, right, based on this algorithm, based on what I'm seeing here, my algorithm applies, which is over 800, flip it. But they might say over 900, so 450. So you have a screen, you have an individual size of 450 before you switch it, right? So all you'd have to do is do that in there, in this block right here, going back to the programming. And once you do that, you know, you can set the size. You basically reorganize it however you want. Another thing you can do is in here have various grids, okay? And just have the right one show based on the right scenario. So let's go ahead and let's see how that would work, right? So I'm gonna go ahead and take this and X grid. This is the wide grid. Now I'm gonna have a wide grid, a narrow grid, and of course they both need to be wrapped in something. So I'm gonna wrap them into standard grid. Okay, so we now have this wide grid, this narrow grid, and it's all wrapped together. So in the narrow grid, there's basically nothing. Okay, so it's all one thing. This goes in here as before. Sorry, this is out here as before. It's all in one stack layout. And that also goes in there. And we don't have that. And there's actually no margin as well. Actually, let's just leave the margin. Why not? Okay, so in the narrow grid, this is what it looks like. And in the wide grid, it's what we already previously created, right? So because the application starts narrow, we're going to hide the wide grid, right? So when you start the application, it's gonna show narrow, right? Then we go in here and we say if the width is greater than or equal to 900, then grid narrow that is visible equals false, wide that is visible equals true. Okay, so all we're doing here is basically we monitor the width, and if the width ever changes, right, then it does that, right? And if the width does not fit that, if the width ever goes more than 900, then it turns on the wide. Otherwise it stays on the narrow, right? So what we're doing here is we're building a very simple way for us to detect size, and based on size detection, present a different user interface to the application. Now, there's a lot of ways that you can do this. And of course, if there's any kind of interactive element here, it can get somewhat confusing. But what you can do is you can have, you know, and we'll get into this a little bit later, you can have controls that you create, a wide control, a narrow control, And then you have all the interactivity inside of those controls, and then you just swap controls here. Instead of showing the whole user interface here, you just you just show one control versus another control, and you just swap between them, one or the other. So let's go ahead and let's run this. Boom. So there we go. So this is loading fine. There's a little bug here, so let's fix that. What is the problem? We don't want to request a height on this. There we go. So we had a height requested for in the previous one. In this case, we don't want a height requested. And actually, um, going back and thinking about this again, we also do not want a margin here. Okay. There we go, right? So this is sort of how it was in the beginning, right? And now let's go ahead and let's maximize that. Boom, right? So as you can see, we maximize it and it's now picking a different user interface and showing that different user interface. And then when we minimize it, it goes back to standard user interface, maximize it, goes back to a larger user interface. So you can imagine in scenarios again where you need to scroll on one side and do something on this side and do something over here, and you see the results over here. It's relatively easy to set up. And then the last thing we want to do is we want to take it and switch the mode. And if, as you can see, once we switch the mode, it actually goes back to um, the way we have it for the narrow mode, because the narrow mode is less than 900, right? Switch back, and it goes back to this, right? So that's basically the UI side of programming a Surface Duo. What we've done in this Xamarin Forms version is we've also illustrated how you can basically create that user interface flow. We've added a little bit of programmability that basically monitors the size of the screen, and based on the size of the screen, it changes the layout. This code that we've added here, if you take this and load it into, let's say, a tablet, and you again move the tablet between landscape and portrait mode. If the landscape mode is less than 900, it will follow the same format, which it should, right? So it's a pretty nifty way of doing this. In the next videos, we'll get into basically using the controls that Microsoft has created for doing this, because apparently they add a little bit more sophistication. For scenarios where you very quickly need to have master detail views and things of that nature, it can create that for you, so you don't have to go out and create it yourself.